Hello, and welcome to Panic in Detroit, 100 years later. This presentation comes from the Panic in Detroit book launch, which took place, you guessed it, in Detroit. Since social distancing during this pandemic prevents me from giving this talk in person, I thought I would share this fascinating piece of history with you virtually. For those who don't know me, my name is Richard Kaczynski. I am a scholar of Western esotericism and new religious movements. I have written or contributed to a lot of books. My best known are Forgotten Templars, The Untold Origins of Ordo Templi Orientis, Perdurabo, The Life of Aleister Crowley, the novel The Billionth Monkey, and The Wiser Concise Guide to Aleister Crowley. My latest, Panic in Detroit, came out in 2019, coinciding with the centennial of Aleister Crowley's publication of his Blue Equinox in Detroit. My book recounts that historic publication, Crowley's attempt to put O.T.O in the Motor City, and the moral panic that followed. So let's get started, shall we? As a quick geography refresher, Michigan is in the shape of a hand, and Detroit is located at the base of the thumb. Now, Aleister Crowley came to the United States in 1914 for a variety of reasons. And specifically, he came to Detroit with a couple of goals in mind. He sought to publish the new issue of his journal, The Equinox, to establish a U.S. headquarters of O.T.O, to promote his Gnostic Mass, and to promote his artwork. So, the rest of this talk will be focused on how we got there and what happened next. Our story begins with Albert W. Ryerson. Descended from a Mayflower family, he grew up in Hollis, New Hampshire, with Ralph Waldo Emerson as his next-door neighbor. In 1896, he moved to Detroit and introduced there the 99-year lease. He was a 32nd degree Freemason, or Prince of the Royal Secret, which will turn out to be very important to Crowley. In 1898, he was the new general manager of the Universal Bookstore, which he bought with two Masonic brothers, Gordon Hill, who served as president, and Hugh Jack, the vice president. As Ryerson testified 4 years later, and the word testify is a spoiler, the Universal Bookstore was formed for the purpose of handling all kinds of religious literature all over the country or the world, with everything that was odd or out of the way. The original store was on Grand River Avenue in downtown Detroit. Before long, they expanded to 3 stores in the city, plus a 4th in Toledo, Ohio. Now, please be advised that in 1921, Detroit changed its address system, so many of the addresses we're going to talk about today no longer exist, at least not by those numbers, but the locations as shown on the map are accurate. As this ad for Universal Bookstores shows, they were the stores that keep books others don't. Looking at Ryerson's want lists in Publishers Weekly prior to meeting Crowley, we see a lot of shared interest, ranging from sacred sexuality down to Rosicrucianism, Theosophy, and the Egyptian Rite of Masonry. Here is a selection of titles that Ryerson was searching for throughout the year 1918 in Publishers Weekly. In October 1918, Ryerson took his new treasurer, William A. Gibson, on a book-buying trip through New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. On this trip, they met Crowley. Ryerson was eager to meet Aleister Crowley, but arranging it proved challenging. At an old address of Crowley's, the staff wouldn't say where he moved to. The janitor finally sent them to Crowley's regular lunch spot, the Brevoort Hotel on 5th Avenue, where they left a note. A couple of days later, they were invited to meet Charles Stansfeld Jones, who would decide if they would be permitted to talk to Crowley. Jones took them downtown to meet Crowley face to face. As Ryerson would testify, and there's that word again, Mr. Crowley was the accredited agent of the British government in the employ of their Secret Services Department. That was one of the reasons why it was always so difficult to get in touch with him. German spies were continually after him, and he would never allow anyone to see him unless he first knew who they were. As Crowley recalled, more than bookselling was on the agenda. His O.T.O. work had generated interest among Detroit Freemasons. The accounts of the new rite attracted the attention of the Supreme Grand Council of the Scottish Rite in the Valley of Detroit, Michigan. This council deputed 2 princes of the royal secret to interview me in New York. Crowley, however, was unwilling to discuss the particulars of O.T.O. with anyone below 33rd degree. It was, of course, impossible for me to deal with subordinates, and I refused to discuss the matter except with Sovereign Grand Inspectors General. After 3 meetings, Ryerson agreed to 3 things: to mark the next volume of the Equinox, to accept a consignment of Crowleyana that had brought from England, and to host a visit to Detroit by Crowley. As a new convert to Thelema, Ryerson was surprised when his wife of 25 years filed for divorce, complaining, "The defendant, by his acts and declarations, appears to be possessed of a religious conviction that he is not bound longer to recognize any of the conventions or formalities of society, but insists that he is free to conduct himself according to the dictates of his own conscience." Ryerson soon found a new lover in Bertha Elmira Bruce. She was the proprietor of a rooming house on 381 West Grand Boulevard. She was also a financial angel who loaned money to the Universal Bookstore's new publishing venture. When Crowley visited Detroit, he shared Ryerson's mistress, known as Bruce of the O.T.O., and stayed at her house. He also wrote a poem about her and considered her to be his next Scarlet Woman. As late as mid-1920, Crowley was torn between her and Leah Hersig. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. While Ryerson returned to Detroit, Crowley made arrangements with New York's Divinity Press to print the Equinox. Crowley's Deputy Grand Master General, Jones, went ahead to Detroit to generate interest in the Equinox and to prepare the Detroiters to work O.T.O. Taking over as Ryerson's new accountant, Jones took an apartment at Elliott Hall and later moved to apartment number 11 at the VA Block Rooms and again to number 11 at the Ivanhoe Apartments. At all of these locations, he held meetings and classes on magic and related topics. He also met lawyer Frank T. Lodge, author of Why Weepest Thou, which he published in 1913 after the loss of his wife. As Crowley wrote in his Confessions, their leader, for all his fine talk, had only one real desire, to communicate with his dead wife. Lodge was past master of Michigan's Grand Lodge Free and Accepted Masons, a Sovereign Grand Inspector General, or 33rd degree, in the Scottish Rite, and the presumptive leader of the embryonic O.T.O. group in Detroit. Jones met with him to draw up a contract for distributing the Equinox and to discuss establishing a Supreme Grand Council of O.T.O. As Jones wrote to Crowley on March 10, 1919, Frank Lodge, 33rd degree, is seriously interested in the O.T.O. and is willing to affiliate and to form a Supreme Council of 3 with you and myself. Crowley responded 3 days later, writing, "Affiliate Frank Lodge, but rub it into him that even our 8th degree wipes its arse with the 33rd. Ah, Crowley, ever a charmer. Regardless, Lodge agreed to affiliate, but unfortunately the similarity of O.T.O.'s rituals to those of Freemasonry proved problematic. As Crowley recounted, the Scottish Rite could not see its way to tolerate the rituals, on the ground that the symbolism in some places touched too nearly that of the Orthodox Masonry of the lodges. In order to meet these views, it was suggested that I should rewrite the rituals in an entirely new symbolism, which would in no way be considered as in competition with the accepted ritual of the craft." Jones stirred up interest in Thelema by giving weekly Monday lectures at the Universal Bookstores. He promoted these talks with a flyer whose flip side also advertised the Equinox. He also spoke in other locations, including the Theosophical Society, where he spoke on astral projection, the Rosebud Club, where he spoke on Eastern and Western methods of attainment, and Garrow's Hall, which was listed in the 1919 Detroit City Directory under Churches and Missions under Thelemites. Soon he started a Sunday afternoon study group on the then unpublished Liber Aleph. Before long, he was teaching 4 days out of the week. Another speaker at the Universal Bookstore's Woodward Avenue location was a man named Russell. This may well have been Cecil Frederick Russell, who was recorded in the 1920 census as sharing a house on Vinewood Avenue with Jones. Here we see the front and back covers of the prospectus for the Equinox. The inside of the prospectus listed the contents of the book. Nicknamed the Blue Equinox for the color of its cover, the book appeared on the Spring Equinox 1919. According to Crowley, it contained a complete program of my proposed operation to initiate, emancipate, and relieve mankind. The book itself consisted of a syllabus of AA instructions, essays on Thelema, organizational and historical documents of O.T.O, a hymn to Pan, the Sevenfold Sacrament, the Book of the Heart Girt with the Serpent, the Gnostic Mass, a Master of the Temple, the first installment of an account of Frater Akkad's magical career up to the grade of Magister Templi, and Jones's essay, Stepping Out of the Old Eon into the New. There's nothing like holding an actual copy of a book that you've worked on. And when the Equinox came out, Jones wrote excitedly to Crowley, I noticed that by concentrating the gaze on the eye and triangle, one gets a very living effect after a few moments. The complementary green coming and going in flashes on the blue background in a very effective manner. Here's an advertisement for the Equinox from Publishers Weekly. Crowley was serious about this world teacher business. The Equinox contained, as a supplemental text, H.P. Blavatsky's The Voice of the Silence with Crowley's commentary. Crowley hoped to issue a 60-cent version through E.P. Dutton. As he pitched the book to them, The Voice of the Silence is the only theosophical publication of the slightest literary distinction or even of occult merit. This new edition is far more valuable to students than any previously published because the meaning of the treatise is, for the first time, made plain by the commentary of Frater O.M. No theosophist can afford to miss buying a copy. He also expected this to be a bombshell in Theosophical Society circles, culminating in Crowley being recognized as the world teacher. As Crowley wrote to Jones on February 19, 1919, I will bet you $1 that the publication of The Voice of the Silence will have the San Francisco earthquake looking like 30 cents. I am just reading through the proofs, and it shocks even me. What will happen to the ordinary, gentle Jesus, meek and mild theosophist, I cannot say, but I suggest you're arranging with the United Undertakers Association for a fat commission. In April 1919, shortly after the Equinox came out, Jones gave lectures to the Theosophical Society. Crowley prepared a manifesto proclaiming himself H.P. Blavatsky's heir as head of the Theosophical Society. But nothing came of it. This would be but the first of several disappointments with the Equinox. Nor was the Theosophical Society the only pipe dream to go bust on the heels of the Equinox. Remember me saying that Crowley was also promoting his artwork? Well, he had an exhibit going on at the Liberal Club in New York's Greenwich Village. At his opening, A.C. described May Morn, pictured here, as follows. The painting represents the dawn of a day following a witch's celebration as described in Faust. The witch is hanged as she deserves, and the satyr looks out from behind a tree. In the background all is beautiful spring, and a nymph dances joyously to the piping of a shepherd. Now, imagine the surprise when the Equinox comes out with this painting as its frontispiece, bearing this description. The picture is symbolical of the new eon. From the blasted stump of dogma, the poison oak of original sin, is hanged the hag with dyed and bloody hair, Christianity. The satyr is a portrait of Frater DDS, one of the teachers of the Master Thurion. The The shepherd and the nymph in the background represent the spontaneous outburst of the music and sound and motion caused by the release of the children of the new eon from the curse of the dogma of original sin and other priestly bogies. Hilarious. When they read this, the trustees of the Liberal Club closed the exhibit. Anxious to proceed with establishing the Supreme Grand Council for the Lake section of the United States, the Detroiters paid Crowley's $100 fare to Detroit. On April 13, 1919, according to Ryerson, a Supreme Grand Council got together at the Detroit Athletic Club, and I think then it was formed, tentatively, if the ritual be rewritten and if drafted and accepted. Now, the Detroit Athletic Club is not a gym, but an exclusive social club. As U.S. District Attorney Frank Murphy would later describe these founding members, they are big men. The mention of their names would immediately bring on a scandal. In addition to Lodge, the council consisted of Dr. Frank E. Bowman, Charles Yale Smith, William Henry Bogrand, Albert Alexander Stibbard, and George Jarvis. Among those on this tentative Supreme Grand Council was Dr. Cedric Putnam Sibley. He worked on the Detroit riverfront for a little place called Park Davis Laboratories, whose facility Crowley had visited back in 1915. As Crowley wrote in his Confessions, Park Davis were charming and showed me over their wonderful chemical works. They were kind enough to interest themselves in my researches in anhelonium lewini and gave me some special preparations on the lines indicated by my experience, which proved greatly superior to previous preparations. During the meeting at the Detroit Athletic Club, Crowley also affiliated 8 Detroit Masons to O.T.O, presumably including the 7 members of the Supreme Grand Council, plus Ryerson, whose certificate is shown here. Affiliation, as you see written at the top, indicated that no initiation was performed, but the members were formally accorded rank in O.T.O commensurate with their degree in Freemasonry. Neither Ryerson nor Hill, the manager and president of your Universal Bookstores, respectively, were invited to sit on the Supreme Grand Council, causing considerable rancor. As Ryerson noted, because of the bookstore's officers not being a part of it, Dr. Hill took great exception and thought that inasmuch as we were going to market the literature of the order, some one of us ought to be represented, and he made some very terse comments about it and Crowley in the store here. And the result of it all was that Hill said, well, we won't handle your books. And then he tried to cancel the order and made a mess of it generally, and that started the fuss between them. Hill would ultimately resign in January 1920 as president of the Universal Bookstores and burn his copy of the Equinox. Within 10 days of that meeting at the Detroit Athletic Club, Crowley sent revised initiation rituals to Jones. It's worth noting that these revised rituals form the basis of the O.T.O degrees through Master Magician as conferred today. On receiving these rituals, Jones advised Lodge, "It is my pleasure to inform you that the revised ritual of the degree of Minerval has been received from the Grand Master. It would be well, I think, that a meeting of the Grand Council be called at an early date to discuss the details of the establishment of an oasis in the city of Detroit and arrange for the production of this degree as soon as possible." Thus, in November 1919, Crowley returned to Detroit, where he and Jones signed as sponsors on the preliminary pledge forms for those seeking initiation proper, rather than just affiliation into O.T.O. This meeting did not go as smoothly as the last. It included only 4 of the original charter members. With that, Crowley left the United States, bound for Cefalu. The Detroiters reversed the ritual of O.T.O one night in November at the home of Albert Winslow Ryerson. It is unclear which ritual was rehearsed. In one place it was described as involving kneeling before a priestess, which suggests the Gnostic Mass. Despite Crowley's comment that the O.T.O wipes its arse with the 33rd degree, Jones took his Blue Lodge initiations at Detroit Masonic Hall No. 2 in March and April of 1920. The following summer, fall, and winter, from 1920 to 1921 saw a great deal of shuffling amongst the Detroit Thelemites. C.F. Russell, who had been in Detroit since the previous May, left in the fall to join Crowley at the Abbey of Thelema. Norman Mudd, on sabbatical from Grey University College in South Africa, turned up looking for Crowley, then set off again to find him in Sicily. And on April 13, 1920, W.T. Smith was fired from his job, so he left Vancouver and took a house with Jones in Detroit to help with the great work. And they lived happily ever after? Not. In September 1920, 6 tons of books for Jones to sell arrived unexpectedly from Crowley. Jones was dumbstruck. He had to beg and borrow money to pay the substantial duty on these books, which he then placed in storage with Detroit's Leonard Warehouse. He sold them on the side for Universal bookstores in an effort to recoup his money. The Equinox, meanwhile, didn't prove as hot a commodity as Crowley predicted, which made investors unhappy. This contributed to a row over who should, in Ryerson words, be the Supreme Grand Cheese, with the result that the Supreme Grand Council fell apart and O.T.O. never actually got off the ground. Seeing the handwriting on the wall, Jones and Smith left Detroit on March 26, 1921, settling in Chicago and forming the Collegium ad Spiritum Sanctum to sell Crowley's books and put out Jones's own writing. In May 1921, the Universal bookstores were in bankruptcy court, with Ryerson charged with allegedly ruining the company by misappropriating $35,000 for publishing the Equinox. This was in fact false, as the actual printing costs of the book were far, far less. Grover L. Morgan, counsel for the creditors and trustees, claimed, "A businessman should have known that the frontispiece of the Equinox, representing the hanging of Christianity on a gibbet, alone would have resulted in the failure of the publishing house." These bankruptcy proceedings drew the attention of the press, and soon the tale of Ryerson, Crowley, and O.T.O. filled the front pages of the January and February 1922 newspapers, in a series of exposés that Ryerson called the Mess in the Press. The first of these articles exposed the existence of Detroit's love cult, as the papers dubbed O.T.O. As a result, prominent elected officials also began condemning the book. Detroit Police Commissioner James W. Inches remarked, "The sort of conduct described in the Equinox is common in Europe, but it will not do for Detroit." Federal prosecutor Paul W. Voorhees was even more vocal. "I consider this book the most remarkable and most degenerate book I have ever seen. I am going to stop the sale of it and will instruct the police to seize every copy found in bookstores in this city. The rights described in the Equinox calls for a sort of conduct that we are not going to tolerate in Detroit if we can prevent it." Finally, U.S. District Attorney Frank Murphy called the Equinox the most indecent and obscene book I have ever seen. In mere days, the news coverage snowballed beyond merely uncovering the existence of a secret society in the city of Detroit. On January 12, 1922, Voorhees obtained a search and seizure warrant, sealing all books in the basement storage facility of Universal bookstores until they were either turned over to creditors or destroyed. Furthermore, Voorhees pointed out that anyone publishing, causing to be published, printing, selling, exposing for sale, distributing, exhibiting, or even having in his possession any book found to be hurtful to the public morals was subject to a $1,000 fine. When bankruptcy lawyer Morden showed Voorhees mail order records for Equinox, the stakes got even higher. If the book was obscene, then sending or receiving it by mail was a federal offense, and if so, a grand jury would be convened to subpoena and prosecute every single person who either produced or purchased the book. Soon, the press published an anonymous divorcee's account of how the Equinox ruined her marriage, using language normally reserved by H.P. Lovecraft. As a result of my husband studying this book, my home is wrecked and I am forced to face the world alone and make my own living. Before this book was given to my husband, he was a good man, true, devoted, and industrious. Night after night he studied this book. He wanted me to read it, but I soon saw that it was not fit even for beasts. I pleaded with him to give it up, but he refused to do so. Finally, he began to go to meetings. He said the book gave him the right to go where he pleased, to do what he pleased, and to love whom he pleased. As a result of my experiences, my health is so broken that, while I want to stamp out this book, my physician tells me that if I go into court that I will die, as my heart has been affected. The story had legs, too, making headlines as far away as Perth. Crazy? Yes. But wait, there's more. At this time, the famous and still unsolved murder of motion picture director William Desmond Taylor occurred. Investigators discovered love letters from 19-year-old actress Mary Miles Minter in Taylor's copy of White Stains. Then, actress Mabel Normand, the last person to see Taylor alive, admitted that she was a recipient of the Equinox and that copies had circulated among many Hollywood luminaries. This drove the bankruptcy attorney Grover Morden to wild conjecture. It is possible that the Order has obtained a foothold in the picture colony, and color is lent to this theory by the frequent occurrence of alleged drug orgies among the movie stars. Some drug-crazed maniac or jealous woman of the O.T.O may have been Taylor's mysterious assailant. That's right. All the drug-fueled orgies in Hollywood are because of O.T.O, according to this theory. Supporting evidence came from the back inside cover of the Equinox, which was actually an inside joke about Crowley's premature obituary of occult author A.E. Waite, which ran in the previous 1913 issue of the Equinox. Crowley loved to hate Waite, and here's a line from an article he wrote in 1922. It took me a very few hours to discover that Waite was as ignorant and he was pompous, and he was very, very pompous. Reproducing in the Equinox headlines about an infamous Waite in Michigan, Crowley claimed his Waite was back from the dead. It turns out that joking about the most notorious poisoning plot in Michigan history isn't very funny, especially to the people who had never heard of A.E. Waite. For all of Crowley's bluster, he acknowledged a debt to Waite's books for getting him started on the path. Waite certainly did start a revival of interest in alchemy, magic, mysticism, and all the rest. But his scholarship was so contemptible, his style so overloaded, and his egomania so outrageous, does not kill to the point of extinction the worth of his contribution. If it had not been for Waite, I doubt if, humanly speaking, I should ever have got in touch with the Great Order. Because Ryerson, as manager of the Universal Bookstores, was the only name the press could attach to the scandal, he was cast as the love cult's ringleader. As Crowley recounted, in Detroit, months after my return to Europe, they repeatedly raided poor half-crazed Ryerson's house in search of some evidence of the devil worshipper's mystic love cult, and of course found nothing, from which they concluded not my innocence, but that my pact with the devil contained a clause guaranteeing me against the discovery of my crimes. The other members of the Great Lakes Council were understandably nervous about being subjected to the same treatment and having their names dragged through the mud. Thus, a deal was struck with Universal Bookstore's main stockholder, Dr. Hill. He would not sue, provided Ryerson would not name any of the other members. He agreed, and in the end, bankruptcy referee George A. Marston ruled all this questioning out of order. The fact that none of these accusations ever panned out or turned into anything became very important in another legal case. This centered around James Branch Cabell's novel Jurgen, which came out in 1919, the same year as the Equinox. Cabell borrows from the Gnostic Mass in chapter 22, as to a veil he broke. Here, Jürgen travels to the land of cocaine, whose pagan philosophy was, do that which seems good to you. Encountering Queen Anaitis, they conduct a ritual. I will quote here. Then Jürgen raised Queen Anaitis so that she sat upon the altar, and that which was there before tumbled to the ground. Anaitis placed together the tips of her thumbs and of her fingers so that her hands made an open triangle. Then Anaitis said, Yea, for I speak with the tongue of every woman, and I shine in the eyes of every woman, when the lance is lifted. To serve me is better than all else. When you invoke me with the heart wherein is kindled the serpent flame, if but for a moment you will understand the delights of my garden, what joy unwordable pulsates therein, and how potent is the sole desire which uses all of a man. To serve me, you will then be eager to surrender whatever else is in your life. And other pleasures you will take with your left hand, not thinking of them entirely. For I am the desire which uses all of a man, and so wastes nothing. And I accept you. I yearn toward you. I, who am daughter and somewhat more than daughter to the sun. I, who am all pleasure and ruin and drunkenness of the inmost sense, desire you. Now Jürgen held his lance erect before Anaitis. Cabell was charged with obscenity by the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. This was a prudish moral police run by Anthony Comstock, who years before had driven Ida Craddock to suicide. Against his lawyer's advice, Cabell defended himself by arguing that his lance ceremony is modeled on the Gnostic Mass, a previously published source which was not deemed obscene. The resulting popularity turned Cabell into a literary giant, and Crowley and Cabell became buddies. Getting back to Ryerson, his last public statement about the O.T.O controversy in which he became embroiled is both succinct and tragic. I was not part of the official organization, nor never was invited, neither was I its head. When trouble came and unsavory notoriety, I was made the goat. I have in my silence practically laid down my life for my friends, who have not shown any disposition to help me in this awful trouble, allowing me to stand the brunt of it all alone when they know I am entirely innocent of any complicity in the matter. My home has been completely ransacked at various intervals, my papers and books seized, my servants bribed, my library robbed, and I have been persecuted beyond endurance by people seeking evidence concerning the O.T.O, which has been in error, dubbed a love cult, and which never had any active existence in Detroit. Ryerson later moved to Georgia, remarried, and disappeared from public life until his 1931 death in Florida. The local press, however, wasn't as quick to forget. Now, as a PS, remember that 2 tons of books that Jones put in storage at the Leonard warehouse? Turns out that the box of rarities was lost and forgotten until discovered in 1958. Local expert in stage magic Robert Lund was called in to assess the collection. This included rare and unique special bindings of Crowley's works. Fortunately, most of these found their way into the collection of the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin. However, the 2 items pictured here were saved by Robert Lund and passed along to another book collector after he died. These came up for auction in the summer of 2015. The book on the left, Gargoyles, went to an unknown seller, whereas the 3-volume work on the right, the vellum edition of Crowley's collected works bound by Zahnsdorf, was purchased and added to the archives of Ordo Templi Orientis. A third book that Lund kept was this amazing manuscript copy of the Book of Lies that came up for sale in 2016. This book as well is currently in the archives of Ordo Templi Orientis. Southeast Michigan's Ordo Templi Orientis body, Blue Equinox Oasis, takes its name from the Equinox Volume 3, Number 1, the Blue Equinox, to acknowledge the historical link which Detroit has with the O.T.O. And so, finally, they did all live happily ever after. If you enjoyed this presentation and want to read more, you can find all the details in Panic in Detroit available at your favorite bookseller. Thank you.